I met my father after 30 years and I'm trying to build a relationship. About pain, hope, and the attempt to build a relationship from scratch when you're both completely different people than you were 3 decades ago. I'm 35, and I just met my biological father for the first time since I was 5. I want to build a relationship, but I don't know how. Mark starts by giving us the background, and right away, you can feel the weight of what he's carrying. He writes, "When I was 5 years old, my father walked out on my mom and me. No goodbye, no explanation that I can remember, no contact afterward. My mom never talked about him much, just that he wasn't ready to be a father, and that we were better off without him." Now, imagine being a 5-year-old kid and having your dad just disappear. That's your foundation right there, the idea that the person who's supposed to love you unconditionally can just decide you're not worth sticking around for. Mark goes on to explain that his mom remarried when he was 12 to a man who became his stepfather, and while the guy was decent enough, there was always this question mark about who his real dad was and why he left. For 30 years, Mark built his life around this absence. He got married, had kids of his own, built a career, all while carrying this weight of abandonment. And here's where it gets really interesting. He says he thought he was over it. He thought he'd processed it, moved on, become a better father himself because of what he experienced. Mark writes, "I got a friend request on Facebook from someone with my last name. When I clicked on the profile, I saw a face that looked exactly like mine, just 30 years older. It was him. My father." Can you imagine that moment? You're scrolling through Facebook, probably thinking about mundane stuff, and suddenly you're face to face with the ghost of your childhood. The person who shaped your entire understanding of abandonment and trust is right there on your screen, asking to be your friend. But here's what gets me about Mark's reaction. He doesn't immediately block him or ignore the request. Instead, he sits with it for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of staring at this friend request, probably checking it multiple times a day, trying to figure out what to do. Finally, he accepts it. His father, let's call him David, immediately sends him a message. And this is where the story gets complicated, because David's first message isn't what you'd expect from someone who abandoned their child. "Hi, son. I know this might be strange, but I've been thinking about you every day for 30 years. I made the biggest mistake of my life when I left, and I've regretted it every single day since. I understand if you don't want to talk to me, but I had to try. I love you, and I'm sorry." Now Mark's sharing this with us, and you can feel the confusion and conflicted emotions jumping off the screen. Because on one hand, this is what every abandoned child dreams of hearing, right? That their parent regrets leaving, that they were loved, that it wasn't their fault. But on the other hand, where do you even begin to process 30 years of abandonment with a single Facebook message? Okay, let's pause here for a second, because I think this is where a lot of us need to check ourselves. It's really easy to have an immediate reaction to this story, either "Forgive him, family is everything," or "Screw that guy, 30 years too late." But the reality is infinitely more complex than that. Mark is dealing with something that most of us can't even imagine. This isn't just about forgiving someone who hurt you. This is about trying to build a relationship with a complete stranger who happens to share your DNA and your deepest childhood trauma. And you can see this complexity reflected in the comments. Some people are saying things like, "Blood is thicker than water, give him a chance." Others are saying, "He made his choice 30 years ago, you don't owe him anything." But here's what I think is really important about Mark's approach. He's not rushing into anything. He's not immediately embracing his father, but he's also not slamming the door shut. He's trying to navigate this with the maturity of a 35-year-old while dealing with the wounded 5-year-old that still exists inside him. And that's something we all carry, isn't it? These younger versions of ourselves that got hurt and never fully healed. Sometimes life gives us opportunities to heal those wounds, but it's never as simple as we'd like it to be. Let's see what Mark decided to do. So Mark decides to respond to his father's message, but he keeps it simple and boundaries heavy. He basically says, "I got your message. I'm willing to talk, but I need to take this very slowly." They start exchanging messages over several weeks. David shares pictures of his life. Apparently he remarried, had another son, and has been working as an electrician. He explains that he left because he was 22, addicted to alcohol, and felt like he was destroying everyone around him. Now, this is where Mark's story gets really real. He writes, "Part of me wanted to believe that he left to protect us, that he was being selfless. But the logical part of my brain kept asking if that was true, why didn't he come back when he got sober? Why didn't he try to reach out when I turned 18? Or 25? Why now?" And honestly, that's the question that haunts this entire story. David claims he's been sober for 20 years and has wanted to reach out for years but was too ashamed. But there's a 15-year window there where he could have tried, and he didn't. Mark starts doing what any rational adult would do. He starts investigating. He looks up his father on social media, finds his other son, Mark's half-brother, and starts piecing together David's life. And here's where it gets messy. David's Facebook is full of family photos with his second family. Pictures of him at his other son's graduation, birthday parties, family vacations. 30 years of memories that Mark was never part of. Mark writes, "Looking at these photos was like watching an alternate version of my life. This is the father I never had, being the father I needed, just with a different kid. Can you imagine how that must feel? To see evidence that your father was capable of being a good dad, he just chose not to be your good dad?" But then Mark discovers something that changes everything. In going through his father's social media history, he finds posts from about 5 years ago where David mentioned trying to find his oldest son and regretting the biggest mistake of his life. So David has been thinking about this for years, but it took him until now to actually do something about it. After 2 months of messaging, David asks if they can meet in person. Just coffee, nothing heavy, just to see each other face to face. Mark agrees, but he brings his wife for support. The meeting happens at a neutral coffee shop halfway between where they both live. And Mark's description of seeing his father for the first time in 30 years is heartbreaking. "When I saw him walk in, it was like looking at myself in 30 years. Same eyes, same smile, same way of holding his shoulders. But also like looking at a complete stranger. He looked older than I expected, more tired. When he saw me, he started crying immediately, and I just didn't know what to feel." They talk for 2 hours. David apologizes over and over. He explains his addiction, his fear, his shame. He talks about how he followed Mark's life from a distance. Apparently he knew when Mark got married, when he had kids, where he worked. He'd been watching but never reaching out. And Mark writes, "The weirdest part was that talking to him felt both completely natural and completely forced at the same time. Like we were strangers trying to perform the roles of father and son." David asks if he can meet his grandchildren. Mark says maybe someday, but not yet. David gives Mark his phone number and says he'd like to try to build a real relationship, not just Facebook messages. And that's where Mark is when he writes this post. Standing at the crossroads between his past and his potential future, trying to figure out whether this man who abandoned him deserves a place in his life now. Now Mark posted an update 6 weeks later, and this is where the story gets even more complicated. Because life isn't a movie where everything gets wrapped up with a neat bow. Mark and David started having weekly phone calls. At first, they were awkward two people trying to fill in 30 years of life in hour-long conversations. But gradually, they started finding common ground. They both love baseball. They both struggle with anxiety. They both have weird habits like organizing their tools in very specific ways. These little genetic echoes that prove they're related, even though they're essentially strangers. But then Mark starts noticing patterns in these conversations that make him uncomfortable. David talks a lot about his regrets, but he also talks a lot about how hard his life has been. His second marriage is struggling. He has financial problems. His other son is distant and doesn't call much. Mark starts to wonder, is David reaching out because he genuinely wants a relationship with his son, or because his life isn't going well and he's looking for something to fill that void? And this is where Mark's emotional intelligence really shines through. He writes, "I realized I was starting to feel responsible for his happiness, the same way I probably did when I was 5. Like if I was just good enough, loving enough, available enough, maybe he'd stay this time. But here's the thing that really gets me about this update. Mark doesn't let that realization make him cynical. Instead, he uses it to set boundaries. He tells David that he's willing to continue building a relationship, but it has to be genuine, not based on David's loneliness or regret. He says they need to get to know each other as the people they are now, not try to recreate a father-son relationship that never existed in the first place. Mark also makes a decision that surprises a lot of the commenters. He starts seeing a therapist specifically to help him navigate this situation. Because he realizes that this isn't just about whether to forgive his father, it's about how to protect himself emotionally while still remaining open to the possibility of connection. The therapist helps him understand something crucial. You can choose to build a relationship with someone without having to heal from all the damage they caused. You can move forward without having to pretend the past didn't happen. So Mark makes a proposal to David. Instead of trying to be father and son right away, why don't they just try to be two adults who are getting to know each other? No pressure to feel immediate love or connection. No expectations about holidays or family gatherings. Just two people building a friendship that happens to have some shared DNA. David agrees, and that's where they are now. They talk once a week. They've met for coffee a few more times. Mark still hasn't introduced David to his children, and he's not sure when or if he will. But here's what's beautiful about where Mark lands. He's not trying to fix everything. He's not trying to get back what he lost. He's just trying to build something new with the information and people he has now. The response to Mark's story was incredible. Thousands of comments from people sharing their own experiences with absent parents, complicated family reunions, and the process of adult relationships with people who hurt them as children. One comment that really stood out to me was from someone who said, "I think the hardest part about being abandoned as a kid is that you spend your whole life either desperately wanting that person to come back, or desperately trying to prove you don't need them. Both responses give them power over your life. What Mark is doing, choosing to engage on his own terms, is taking that power back." And I think that's exactly right. Mark isn't letting his father's abandonment control his decision-making anymore, but he's also not letting his father's return control it either. He's making choices based on what he wants, and what feels healthy for him right now. Another comment that really hit me was from someone who wrote, "My father reached out to me after 25 years, and I immediately said yes to everything because I was so grateful he wanted a relationship. I ended up getting hurt all over again because I didn't protect myself. I admire Mark for taking it slow." And that's something we see a lot, isn't it? When someone who hurt us shows up wanting to make amends, we sometimes jump at the chance without thinking about whether they've actually changed or whether the relationship they're offering is the one we actually want. But there were also comments from people who disagreed with Mark's approach. Some people felt like he was being too cautious, that life is short and family is precious. One person wrote, "Forgiveness doesn't mean you have to protect yourself from the person you're forgiving. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith." And you know what? That's valid too. There's no one right way to handle a situation like this. What I love about Mark's story is that it shows us that healing doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes healing isn't about getting closure or having tearful reunions or finding perfect resolution. Sometimes healing is about learning to make choices from a place of strength rather than from your wounds. Mark could have said no to his father entirely, and that would have been completely valid. He could have said yes to everything his father wanted, and that would have been understandable too. Instead, he chose a third option, to engage thoughtfully, with boundaries, and to prioritize his own emotional well-being while still remaining open to connection. And maybe that's the real lesson here. We don't have to choose between being completely closed off and being completely vulnerable. We can choose to be selectively open, strategically trusting, and intentionally cautious. We can protect ourselves while still leaving room for good things to happen. Mark posted one final update about 8 months after his original post, and it's probably not what you'd expect. He and David are still in contact, but their relationship has settled into something Mark describes as friendly but not deep. They talk every couple of weeks now instead of every week. They've met for coffee maybe a dozen times. David has met Mark's children exactly once, at Mark's oldest daughter's birthday party, but only briefly. And Mark seems okay with this. He writes, "I think I was expecting either a fairy tale reunion or a dramatic disaster. Instead, I got something much more ordinary. David is just a person, not a villain, not a hero, just a flawed person who made a really big mistake when he was young and has spent most of his life dealing with the consequences." Mark says that knowing his father hasn't healed all his abandonment issues, but it has answered some questions. He knows now that David's leaving wasn't about Mark not being worthy of love, it was about David not being capable of giving love at that time in his life. He also knows that David isn't the father figure he fantasized about as a child, but he's not the monster he sometimes imagined either. He's just a guy who's screwed up really badly and is trying to make some kind of amends. But here's what I think is the most powerful part of Mark's final update. He writes, "The best part of this whole experience wasn't getting to know David. It was realizing that I'm okay either way. Whether he stays in my life or not, whether we get closer or drift apart, I'm going to be fine. That 5-year-old inside me who was so afraid of being abandoned finally understands that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to abandon myself. And that, friends, might be the most beautiful ending to this story. Not, 'We lived happily ever after,' or, 'I learned to forgive completely,' but, 'I learned that I'm okay.'" Mark's story reminds us that sometimes the most radical thing we can do is neither completely forgive nor completely shut out the people who hurt us. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is just be okay. To engage with life and relationships from a place of self-respect rather than from our wounds. The last thing Mark wrote really stuck with me. He said, "I used to think that having a relationship with my father would fill this hole in my life. Now I realize that I'm the only person who can fill that hole. David can be part of my life or not, that's up to both of us, but my sense of completeness doesn't depend on him anymore." Mark's story is still ongoing. Life doesn't wrap up neatly like movies do. But I think there's something really beautiful about choosing to be okay with uncertainty, to be open to connection without being desperate for it, and to heal in your own time and in your own way. If you're dealing with complicated family relationships, absent parents, or trying to figure out how much space to give people who hurt you in the past, maybe Mark's approach has something to offer. You don't have to choose all or nothing. You can choose something in between. You can protect yourself and still leave room for good things to happen. What do you think? Are you team, "Give Dad another chance"? Or team, "30 years too late"? Or are you somewhere in between like Mark? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible Reddit stories that make us think about our own lives a little differently. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.